a secret, revolutionary, even heretical message that challenged the Catholic Church and the powerful authorities of the time. A message so overwhelming and relevant, capable of rewriting our knowledge and beliefs. Imagine that all of this is hidden in one of the most famous works in the history of art, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. Over the centuries, this work has captured the attention of scientists and scholars from all over the world. And as many of you probably know, it has fueled theories, speculations, and fascinating mysteries. But what is true in all of this? Is there really a hidden message? And if there is, what did Leonardo da Vinci want to communicate to us that was so shocking he had to hide it from everyone's eyes? Today we will take an extraordinary journey, an adventure that will lead us to discover the hidden meaning behind this iconic work of art. In an attempt to shed light on the mysterious message that Leonardo left behind, we will explore ancient documents and extraordinary testimonies that, we are sure, will spark your curiosity. Well, before we move on, as we always do, we remind you to subscribe to the channel to support our work and to not miss our upcoming videos. To fully understand the journey we are about to embark on today, let's start from the beginning by answering a fundamental question. What is a Cenacolo? Cenacoli are artistic representations of the Last Supper from the Gospels, in which Jesus Christ shares the Passover meal with his apostles on the evening before his passion. In this solemn moment, Jesus announces the betrayal of one of his disciples and establishes the Eucharist, one of the most important events for the Christian religion. The term Cenacolo comes from the Latin cenaculum, which means dining room or upper room, just like the place where the Last Supper took place. The most important representations of the Last Supper are actually found in the refectories of convents and monasteries, the rooms where the religious consumed their meals. The choice to place the Last Supper in these spaces had a profound symbolic meaning. During meals, the monks were invited to reflect on the Eucharist and the value of fraternal communion, recalling the gesture of sharing by Jesus with his apostles. And it is precisely in a refectory, that of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, where the most famous Last Supper is found. The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, one of the most iconic works in history. Leonardo da Vinci, to paint this marvelous work, adopted a very particular technique, different from the traditional frescoes of the time. Frescoes were normally painted on fresh plaster so that the pigments could bind to the damp surface and ensure greater durability over time. However, this technique was not suitable for Leonardo's vision, as he wanted to create a scene full of details, nuances, and depth, which were impossible to achieve with such speed. For this reason, Leonardo, in 1495, decided to experiment with a mixed technique. Instead of using the traditional fresco, he painted on dry plaster, using a combination of tempera and oil, applied on a layer of gesso that he prepared on the wall. This technique allowed him to work calmly, adding meticulous details and creating soft shading, in line with his innovative style and his scientific approach to light and depth. Unfortunately, this choice turned out to be problematic for the preservation of the work because due to the dry plaster, the pigments did not bond firmly to the wall. As happens with traditional frescoes, this made the painting extremely vulnerable to humidity and environmental changes. And just a few years after its completion, the Last Supper began to show signs of deterioration, with parts of the painting peeling off and fading. Vasari, who visited the refectory in 1550, just over 50 years after its creation, described what he saw in this way.
Leonardo made in Milan, for the friars of Santa Maria delle Grazie, a marvelous and admirable Last Supper, which he completed with great effort and dedication. And truly, it was a most beautiful thing, because with the liveliness and expressive gestures of the figures, it could not have been done better. But since his technique was not suited to working in fresco, he painted it in oil on the wall. So, because he did not use the fresco technique, the work has deteriorated in such a way that it did not last. All that remains is a mess.
Just a few years after it was created, Leonardo's work already appeared deeply damaged. Over the years, in an attempt to preserve it, Many restoration attempts have been made, some of which have further damaged the work. And as if that weren't enough, the convent itself experienced catastrophic events throughout its history. For example, during the Napoleonic era, at the end of the 18th century, the convent was occupied by French troops and transformed into. The soldiers reportedly used the hall as a stable, leaving the painting completely unprotected during their activities. There are accounts describing how some soldiers even amused themselves by throwing stones at the painted wall or used the wall for target practice. This disastrous treatment worsened the already precarious state of preservation of the artwork. But the greatest threat came during World War II when Milan was heavily bombed. A bomb hit the refectory itself, destroying much of the building. The wall on which the Last Supper was painted was saved only because a barrier of sandbags had been erected to protect it, which lessened the impact of the explosions. From this brief historical summary, we can easily imagine how Leonardo's work has been damaged over the centuries. If we add to all this the deterioration caused by the technique used to paint it, it's easy to imagine how the entire work has been altered over the years. To this, as we were saying, we must add the numerous restorations that have taken place over the years, some of which have been more destructive than beneficial. But let's not dwell on this any further. However, it's useful to know that between 1978 and 1999, the work underwent the most important restoration in its history, where they tried to recover as much as possible. And today we can consider it the best compromise between the recovery of the work and the respect for the authenticity of what remained. Keeping in mind everything we've said so far, we're about to enter the most mysterious part of this video. The first question that comes to mind at this point is this: if Leonardo's work has undergone multiple restorations, how can we identify what is Leonardo's work and what has been altered by the restorers? As we've seen, just a few years after the work was completed, it was already starting to show signs of deterioration. But the success of the work was so great that after it was completed, many copies were made, some of which have survived to this day. And these give us a more precise idea of what the painting must have looked like in Leonardo's time. Among the copies most faithful to what we believe to be the original work, we find the one by Giampietrino, which is now kept at Magdalen College in Oxford. Having clarified all these fundamental points, let's analyze Leonardo's work and what are believed to be the clues to his hidden message. The first thing that stands out when looking at Leonardo's work is the composition. Leonardo seems to have dynamically depicted the moment when Jesus tells his disciples that someone will soon betray him. As we were saying, Last Suppers have a long tradition, but the one created by Leonardo shows some innovative aspects. We have already identified the first element. The work appears dynamic, almost in motion. The second element is the placement of Judas, the apostle who will betray Jesus. Traditionally, up until that moment, Judas was placed on the other side of the table. An example is the Last Supper by Andrea del Castagno. This was a common technique and useful to emphasize Judas's betrayal and his estrangement from the other disciples. Leonardo, on the other hand, if not the first, is certainly one of the first to place Judas together with the other apostles. He doesn't separate him from the others, and we can identify him because he is holding the coins, the reward for his betrayal. By observing the work, we also notice that the apostles are divided into groups of three, almost as if to recall the concept of the Trinity. In the center instead, we find Jesus, isolated from all the others, perhaps to symbolize the loneliness of his condition. But one of the details that has sparked a lot of discussion is definitely Peter's arm placed behind his back. Peter's hand is firmly gripping a knife, and it is in a position that appears twisted and unnatural. A second detail is the depiction of John, Jesus' beloved apostle, who, upon closer inspection, appears to have feminine features. As many of you may know, this topic has been widely discussed since the release of the book The Da Vinci Code, but we will return to this important issue shortly. Let's start with the first element, Judas's position. And to do this, we use the analysis of Luca Zampi, an independent researcher whose hypothesis we found very fascinating. You can find his full interview on the channel. Note that, and for those interested, we'll put all the links with references in the description. Luca Zampi starts from the hypothesis that the hand holding the knife is not Peter's, but that of another apostle, perhaps John. We don't see this man in the depiction because he's hidden under the table, and we only see his hand. The apostle sitting to the right of Jesus would therefore not be John, but most likely Mary Magdalene. To arrive at this hypothesis, Zampi starts from a detail, the door present beneath the figure of Jesus Christ. If we look at Leonardo's Last Supper, we can't help but notice that in the lower part of the painting, there is the frame of a door. This door was not present when Leonardo painted the work, but was made at a later time. Historical accounts tell us that this was probably made around the year 1652 and was created to provide a direct connection between the refectory and the kitchen. Luca Zampi in his analysis also shows us this photo, a photo that, as we will see, is undoubtedly very curious. This image was actually taken in 1896, and as we can see, it does not show the door that should actually be there, because as we said, it was built in 1652. The later photos of the refectory, like this one, which is believed to have been taken between 1900 and 1924, instead show the door as we know it today. The door. Looking at these images, it would therefore seem not to be from 1652, but from the end of the 19th century. But how is that possible? When was this door actually made? We'll come back to that later. But first, there's another interesting element to analyze. According to Zampi, the construction of the door erased a very important detail, the presence of a stool placed on the opposite side of the table. But how did he come to this hypothesis? By observing the images of the refectory, Zampi noticed that next to Leonardo's work, there had been a painting displayed for a long time that appeared to be an exact copy of Leonardo's work. As we said, the painting created by Leonardo had suffered a lot of damage over time, and so probably in the past, it was decided to place a copy of the painting next to the original, perhaps to give visitors a more faithful and clearer version of the work. We can see in this photo how the room must have looked. At the end of the hall, the Last Supper, and on the right, the copy of Leonardo's work. The painting that Zampi is talking about we know is a work by Andrea Solario, considered by many to be a faithful copy of the original. By analyzing the photo of Solario's painting, Zampi identifies in the chiaroscuro of the image what appear to be the legs of a stool. Unfortunately, it is not possible to make a more precise analysis because the painting was destroyed by the bomb that hit the refectory in 1943. Clearly, if Zampi were right, and if what he identifies in Solario's copy really is a stool, important questions would arise. If in fact no one is sitting on the stool, and the 12 apostles are seated behind the table, then who was the stool for? Perhaps for the man under the table holding the knife. And who is this man? If we see Judas sitting next to Peter, and if the apostle sitting next to Jesus were not John, but Magdalene, then it would have to be an apostle, perhaps John. At this point, let's analyze the second element, Peter's arm and the hand holding the knife. Many independent researchers have dealt with this aspect, so let's summarize the most widely shared opinion. If we look at the detail of the arm, we notice that the hand is in a position that many consider unnatural, but that's not all. Some researchers say the arm would be disproportionate to Peter's figure. This would be a mistake that Leonardo, who as we know was a careful student of human anatomy, would never have made. It would be a deliberate mistake, meant to emphasize the importance of this element. If we also look at the detail of the wrist, and in particular the color of the skin, we see that it is slightly different in color compared to the hand. This is because, in reality, Peter's hand would be gripping the wrist of the hand holding the knife, and the hand holding the knife would therefore belong to another mysterious man. All this brings us to the third element, the figure of John. As we were saying, the figure of John in Leonardo's work appears more like that of a woman than that of a man. The Gospels describe John as a boy with androgynous features, very different from the other apostles who appear with much more masculine traits. If we even look at the copies of Leonardo's work, which are therefore more faithful to what is believed to be the original, John's face appears even more feminine, and this resemblance becomes remarkable. If we look at another very famous painting by Leonardo, if we look at the two images and compare them, it's hard not to think they show features of the same person. These elements would tell a very different story compared to the official version, and we can sum all this up in two hypotheses. According to the researcher Luca Zampi, Leonardo da Vinci might be telling a story of a different betrayal than that of Judas, a more hidden betrayal which would concern Peter, the founder of the Catholic Church. The real betrayal, according to Zampi, would consist in Peter's role in founding a church, which places the church, God, outside of each of us, a message profoundly different from that of Christ in the apocryphal Gospel of Thomas. In fact, Jesus states,
I am the light that is over all of them. I am the all came forth from me, and the all has come to me. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift the stone, and you will find me there.
So the betrayal of Peter, who is most likely in cahoots with John, the man to whom the hand holding the knife would belong. It is the representation of how the apostles favored by Jesus actually betrayed him, giving life and form to what would later become the Catholic Church. Other researchers, however, following the interpretation made famous by Dan Brown's novel, suggest instead that the hidden message in the painting of the Last Supper reveals another truth, the central role of Mary Magdalene. Observing the composition of the painting, in fact, they highlight the presence of an empty V between the figure of Jesus and the one that, according to the theory, would be Mary Magdalene. This V is interpreted as a symbol of the sacred feminine and would represent the sacredness of the feminine principle. The V is also seen as a symbol of the chalice or the womb, symbols of fertility and continuity. According to this interpretation, Jesus and Mary Magdalene would have been linked by a relationship, and this union would have given The absence of a chalice on the table, traditionally understood as the Holy Grail, is considered a further clue. The real Grail, in fact, would not be a physical cup, but Mary Magdalene, seen as the vessel of Jesus' bloodline and a symbol of his spiritual and human legacy. A particularly interesting element highlighted by supporters of this theory is that by superimposing the mirrored image of the Last Supper onto the original, figures would appear in the center. The figure of Jesus Christ remains recognizable but changes in color. His clothing appears almost entirely red, and the gesture of his hand seems to represent the blessing of the bread and wine, transforming the meaning of the scene. So, it would no longer be the moment when Jesus announces the betrayal, but rather a reference to the sacrament of the Eucharist. Furthermore, the blue robe in the center and the plate in front of Jesus seem to form the same shape as a cup, the one that is missing in Leonardo's original painting. Moving to the left side of the table, another detail emerges, even more enigmatic and surprising, a figure that many interpret as that of a Templar knight. Back at the center of the painting, you can finally see what appears to be an infant in the arms of one of the apostles. These are just some of the most relevant details. Many researchers have identified additional interesting elements, but the most important question to answer is this: are these simply coincidences or the result of meticulous and intentional study on the part of Leonardo? This double aspect of Leonardo's Last Supper would not be an isolated case, according to some scholars. This characteristic is present in many other works by Leonardo, for example, in his self-portrait. By applying the same superimposition technique, new forms would emerge. We have analyzed the most interesting and hidden aspects of Leonardo's work. Before proceeding and drawing conclusions from everything we've discussed, it is necessary and appropriate to present the official version's opinion and the views of the skeptics. So let's go back to the first point, the opening of the door, which would conceal the presence of the stool. As we said, the official and historical version of Leonardo's work tells us that around 1600, a door was opened that would have connected the refectory with the kitchen. To better understand, let's look for information in historical testimonies and in the General Archive of the Religious Fund of Milan. And here we find the testimony of Padre Domenico Pino, the last prior of Santa Maria delle Grazie, who in 1796 wrote a treatise on the history of the Last Supper, where he provides us with some important information gathered from the convent's archive, in which it is stated that the opening of the door beneath the Last Supper would have taken place in 1652.
It happened around the year 1652, and this is clearly shown by the receipts from the carpenters and other craftsmen who worked in the refectory for the indicated purpose, which can still be found in the convent's archive, although they date back to a few years before the date reported by the prior. The document is, for now, the only one of its kind, and it could perhaps suggest a date that matches the door below. The Last Supper, this painting on the wall, had almost been lost for such a long time, and so the fathers, not caring for it, did not pay attention. To enlarge the door, they cut through the wall, also cutting off the feet and legs of the figure of the Redeemer that remains above that door.
The monks' action remains curious, as they decided to damage Leonardo's work by opening the door. If it is true that this action seems justified by the fact that the Last Supper was in a state of extreme decay, it is also true that it was a work that had achieved great success, and in any case, it would always have meant damaging it further. There is also another factor to consider. Recent restorations have raised the floor of the room, which was originally several meters lower. So one might wonder if it was really necessary to build such a large door, and if its size was actually needed. A need related to the convenience of easily passing food and dishes through, or if instead its construction followed other logic. Regarding the painting by Andrea Solario, as we said, it was destroyed in the bombing of 1943, so we have no way to analyze it. But even in this case, we can't help but add that in all the other copies that were made during the same period. In Solario's painting, the stool that Zampi claims to identify in Solario's painting is not present. A lot has been written about Peter's arm and the hand holding the knife. Studies have also been found that Leonardo did on this particular position of the arm. According to skeptics, this would prove that Leonardo had carefully studied this element, and therefore, that is undoubtedly Peter's hand. Even in this case, the copies of Leonardo's work made in the years immediately following would seem to disprove the hypothesis of those who claimed that the hand belonged to someone else. Because if in Leonardo's Last Supper this element appears ambiguous, perhaps due to the numerous restorations and the damage suffered by the work, in the copies, the hand with the knife is definitely Peter's. The female figure that tradition attributes to John, and in which many see the figure of Mary Magdalene, is a more complex matter. It is undoubtedly true that the figurative tradition and the same. There are many works that we can show both before and after Leonardo's work. But it is also true that Leonardo, and we can see this even more clearly in the copies that have been made over time, he depicts John with features that very convincingly resemble those of a woman. But before we get to our final thoughts, let's add John. Mary Magdalene, a work by Leonardo, a representation of the sacred feminine and of her possible lineage. They are seen by official research as fanciful reconstructions that have no real connection to reality. Having thus very briefly summarized the objections of the skeptics, which seem to dismantle any possibility of a secret message, we could declare the matter definitively closed, but before doing so, we need to analyze everything from another point of view and immerse ourselves in the reality of the era in which they lived. In 1573, the Dominican monks commissioned Paolo Veronese to create a Last Supper that was to be placed in the refectory of the convent in Venice, and it was supposed to replace the painting by Titian, which had been destroyed in a fire in 1571. However, Paolo Veronese decided to create a work that was different from the usual. He filled the painting with dwarfs, animals, and acrobats. He used the festive worldly style he had tried in earlier works for everything he depicted. In this case, however, representing the Last Supper of Christ in such a style was seen as a harsh offense to the Catholic Church. The painting was rejected and Veronese was put on trial by the Inquisition. In the end, the artist was not imprisoned, but he was forced to remove the elements that were less respectful of tradition, and was also required to change the name of the work, which was no longer the Last Supper but the feast in the house of Levi. So, a different episode, a gospel episode, a private feast held by a wealthy tax collector, which therefore was well suited for a representation of this kind. This episode is very useful for understanding the atmosphere of that time. In fact, if Leonardo had intended to include improper elements in his work that aimed to convey a heretical message, this would have had to be well hidden. In fact, we must not forget that Leonardo's Last Supper would have been thoroughly analyzed by the people of that time, and it would have been in view of the monks who ate their meals each day while looking at it. If we look at everything from this perspective, everything takes on a different meaning. For example, the fact that the sketches were found. And the study of the twisted position of Peter's arm is no longer a definitive element to close the matter. Why did Leonardo study Peter's arm position so carefully? To render that grip more precisely and realistically. There's no doubt about it. But this does not change the fact that looking at the work as a whole, this element could have been placed there intentionally to create ambiguity, a well-hidden clue to another story. The same goes for the figure of John. Although tradition has often depicted him with androgynous features, Leonardo, by giving him distinctly feminine characteristics, would not have made a truly revolutionary gesture. If this depiction had seemed scandalous or inappropriate to the people of his time, the work probably would not have reached us. It would have been censored, and Leonardo himself would have risked being tried by the Inquisition. The only chance Leonardo would have had to convey a hidden message would have been to carefully calibrate the visual elements, pushing just enough to communicate what he wanted, but without crossing the limits of what would have been acceptable at the time. Only through this delicate balance could the artist have ensured the survival of his work. Today, as we have unfortunately seen, the Last Supper that has come down to us has undergone multiple touch-ups and restorations, and we do not know what its original appearance might have been. We cannot determine with certainty whether Leonardo intentionally played with colors and shapes to create ambiguous images that could be subject to other meanings. We cannot know whether the ambiguity that appears before our eyes today is the result of Leonardo's skillful hands, or simply the outcome of multiple restorations and the ravages of time. However, we can say that judgment on all this is suspended, or at the very least, we should look for other elements in other works and in Leonardo's own life. And this, if you wish, we can address in a future video. At this point, we invite you to write your opinion in the comments. And we would be happy if those of you who have additional information could enrich the discussion or answer the questions that remain open. So, write in the comments, and if you like the video and want to support our work, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story. Author of Smile.